Hello, everyone. This is Diane Rasmussen McAdie with UK Column News. I'm really happy today to be joined by Professor Gloria Moss for what is going to be a very important and hopefully interesting and revealing discussion about the nature of universities in the UK as they exist now in modern times. I've been working with Professor Moss on a number of issues recently, including what's going on in libraries with the children's books. She's written a fabulous article for us recently for UK Column about the Fabians, and she's now doing a 3-part series for us on the idea of post-truth in our society. But today, we're going to be focusing on universities. So again, Gloria, welcome to UK Column. Do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you relate to the topic of universities?
Yeah, great to be back, Diane. And in terms of myself, I'm a bit of a hybrid because I spent some of my career in industry as a training person. I've got an HR background, organizational psychology, improving organizations and the quality of the culture in organizations has been a big priority in that part of my life. And then I moved onto academia in order to actually investigate cognitive sex differences. Yeah, I did that at a time when the talk about androgyny was looming on the horizon. And I'd made a discovery and was very keen to get that discovery, which countered androgyny, countered the whole notion that you can actually change your sex. I was very keen to get that research through peer review. And I did that. And then I moved on to doing research on this abiding interest of mine, healthy organizations, how to turn toxic organizations into healthy ones. And I focused on leadership and best practice leadership. And all of that was in a mainstream British university. And after I became a professor, I had more time to do this research. I've written about 80 peer-reviewed journal articles and conference papers and 8 books. After 2019, the university system, such as it was didn't provide the hospitable environment in which I could continue that work. So I now work independently. I work as an independent researcher. But I know the university system very well because I worked in it, the mainstream university system, for many years. And what we're going to do today is talk about what is that like, that university system, and is it fit for purpose? You worked in the university system, Diane, and you're now outside that system.
Yes, absolutely. It's really changed quite a bit in what for me seems like a relatively short amount of time. When I started my PhD and went through kind of the process of what was, going through the promotion process over 20 years and eventually reaching full professor, I would say that when I started my PhD, which was 2002 and finished in 2006, and got the title of full professor starting in 2023. And then I was shortly afterward erased from my profession for doing what I thought was what professors were supposed to do, which is to question things. That's what I was taught I was supposed to be doing when, as a professor, especially as what I achieved to be, the intellectual top of my field in terms of leadership and education and research. And like you, built a very large CV around my topic in informatics and libraries. And it really just changed quite a bit from when I got into the system in the beginning, which of course started in America. And then I worked in Canada and then came to the UK to work in 2015. In the very beginning, it was sort of like, find the questions that you want to ask. You have the right to ask those questions, and it's your responsibility to use the data that you gather to answer those questions. But it just, I think even in the past few years for me, maybe you have a different perspective, that changed quite significantly just in those 20 years. So I guess it would be helpful for our viewers to hear a little bit about the background of universities, since we're kind of talking about the modern crisis in universities. So if you want to maybe go into some of the background and the history of universities, I think that would be helpful to start the conversation.
Yes, because as you say, even in your lifetime, you've seen major change. And if we look at the span of history, then my goodness, there's major change. And some of this is detailed in this book, published by Truth University Press, entitled The Dark Side of Academia, How Truth is Suppressed. And that's written by the secret professor. And there's a foreword from John Hamer and an afterword from Dr. Tess Lorry. So there you can read about the history of universities. They actually go back to 1088. Bologna has the crown, and students and teachers, quite simple really, would come together. And that is where the word university comes from. The title of these organizations was, in Latin, Universitas Scholarium, a group of scholars and teachers. And they were small groups. They were not the massive edifices that you think of today, not at all. And Oxford followed in quick succession in 1096, Paris 1150, and the rest is history, shall we say. Originally, those groups of scholars, well, the scholars were foreign nationals, actually, in those cities. And would you believe it, the scholars, the students would actually decide the academics' salaries. My goodness, how that's changed today, as we see vice-chancellors on stratospheric salaries. So the beginning was way back in the 11th century, and thinking on universities, of course, changed. You know, from the original Universitas Scholarium et Magistrorum, groups of scholars and teachers, thinking changed. And when we reached the 18th, 19th century, an important figure, von Humboldt in Germany, he conceived of universities as a place for the cultivation of the mind and character. And he saw university work as being rooted in principles of neutrality and freedom from ideological and private interests. And maybe those listening to our conversation would think that is how universities remain, as sort of neutral beacons of enlightenment. Well, we'll find out whether this is the case or not. But Humboldt wasn't a lone voice, shall we say. We could mention others, but I'd like to single out a remarkable president of the University of Chicago. He was actually the 7th president, George Beadle. We're talking 1950s now. He spoke about the importance of the quest for truth. He was a high-flying geneticist. He'd actually shared a Nobel Prize in 1958 for his research into the role of genes in regulating biochemical events within cells. Listen to what this fine mind said. He said, quotes, one cannot search for truth with a closed mind or without the right to question or doubt at every stage. Any injunction to close the mind, to restrict one's beliefs arbitrarily, or to accept on authority without doubt violates the concept of freedom of the mind. And many of you will say that this is your ideal of a university as well. And many will say, possibly, that actually now we've come a very long way away from the vision of Humboldt and of George Beadle. And this is what Diana and I are going to look at today. Have we moved away? And if we have moved away, from these striking visions? What are the factors that are to blame? Well, I think we have to start with the subject of funding, which many might say is at the root of the changes that Diane mentioned earlier in her own career and the changes that we've seen since the universities of Humboldt and George Beadle. We all know the phrase, "He who pays the piper calls the tune." And you'll see in the graphic, you see it very clearly what's been happening where funding of British universities is concerned. And it will be a similar story in many other countries as well. What you'll see is a dramatic decline in government funding to British universities. We see that between the years 2010 and 2022 to 3, these are figures from the Commons Library in Parliament, that government funding to universities fell, listen to this, from £16 billion to just £4 billion over that period of a little more than 10 years. So the reality now is that government monies for teaching in universities has reduced by a massive 75%. And the budget for teaching is now a quarter what it was and reducing. And government monies for research have reduced by the same amount, 75%, and have fallen from a high of £10 billion. Now, I'm not saying that government funding is necessarily all fine and dandy, because, of course, government funding, when I've looked at calls for research put out by the research councils of Britain and other countries, that those calls for research inviting academics to apply for government monies, as you might have predicted, they're following very much mainstream agendas. Example, the Economics and Social Science Research Council, ESRC. They've funded these projects in the past: learning to like robots, attracting international students who pay more fees than national ones, how to attract them to the UK. So we're not saying that government funding for research is necessarily the panacea, but what we can say with certainty is that now the volume of funding has dropped so dramatically. The shortfall has been made up by private funding. This is a table showing the monies going to universities from two of the biggest funders of universities today, worldwide. And yeah, you've probably guessed it. It's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and it's the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust has a massive £16 billion in its coffers to offer to universities in the decade leading up to 2032. So how is this money being spent? Well, if you look at the table, you can see the Gates Fund totaled a massive 11 billion, I mean, slightly less than the Wellcome, but still very large, which was offered to 471 universities worldwide in 66 countries. So you can see the impact that Bill Gates funding is having on universities worldwide. Looking at Britain, Oxford was the biggest beneficiary of Gates funding, receiving a whopping $375 million over a 4-year period, 2014 to 18. And as we move on in time, Oxford received almost $10 million for research on vaccines. In 2020, another almost $11 million for improving understanding of COVID and creating what they call therapeutic accelerator. And the Wellcome Trust co-funded that project, that last project. Cambridge has also received Gates funding, not to the same amount as Oxford, but some of the money that they've received, they use to fund what they call Gates Scholars. So we can kind of second guess the kind of research that those Gates Scholars might be doing. And note that Gates received, even though he never completed his first degree, he received an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University. It always helps to have friends in high places, does it not, Diane? and we mustn't forget Imperial, who led the clarion call during COVID times. They received a massive $185 million from the Bill Gates Foundation, and 140,000 for modelling COVID. And that was the model, Professor Ferguson behind that one, that predicted 500,000 deaths. A computer model, which has been widely critiqued. UCL, University College London, high-ranking university, 2019, they received close to $11 million for their research on vaccines. Southampton University, likewise, smaller sum, but for research on vaccines. And, I didn't want to crowd out the table, but the theme continues. University of Exeter received funding for examining the potential for BCG vaccination to reduce the impact of COVID-19 in healthcare workers. Warwick University received nearly $14 million for research pressing the danger of variants. So the universities were standing tall, shall we say, behind the COVID narrative. And many of you will have heard Bill Gates telling the world that if you invest in vaccines, then you have a 20-to-1 return on your investments, turning $10 billion into $200 billion. And here we have the universities complicit in this, courtesy of Bill Gates funding. I don't know what you think of this, Diane.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that, Gloria, as well, that it's not just Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust, which are obviously major funders, but it's also the people who support the research in terms of what needs to happen in publications, because obviously your research gets funded based on a certain agenda, and then if your research doesn't align with the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, which you have to indicate when you upload your research nowadays into university systems, when your articles or your books get published, then you're not actually able to put them into the system. So if you haven't met SDG 7 or 13 or whichever one you think can relate to your research, then the university doesn't want even to see that you've had it published. So that all, of course, relates to the funding, because if you can't get it published, then you don't have any reason to get the funding. And so it all has to work together. So I think this then goes into, I guess, the next issue of peer review, right? So we all know potentially that, we know as academics that peer review has to happen to make sure that supposedly it's reviewed by experts before it gets published. But there are some issues of corruption going on as well, I would say, within peer review. So I'll let you talk a little bit more about that.
Peer review is an absolute critical part of the academic system, if not the linchpin of the whole system. Created by Robert Maxwell in 1951. Yep, peer review didn't exist before then, with arguably highly questionable funding, kickstarting the whole thing. And if you'd like to read more about that, I published an article. It's published on Principia Scientific website. Just Google my name and Robert Maxwell, and you'll see some information on this highly questionable funding. And I suppose there are two big problems with peer review. And I say that as somebody who's had sort of up to 80 articles through peer review, and I've acted as a reviewer on editorial boards myself. But the two big problems really are, firstly, the very conservative nature of academic journals. Conservative is a rather kind word. 2 articles in a highly ranked journal have actually pointed this out. Very fascinating, this. The journal is the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the 2 articles were published in 2021 and then again in 2024. And the first of those articles in PNAS concluded that innovative papers were more likely to be rejected than less innovative articles. And the second article from 2024 in the same journal highlighted the fact that 3 elite medical journals had desk rejected 12 of the 14 articles that had become the most popular in their field. In other words, elite journals, the top journals that academics in top institutions are encouraged, bludgeoned, you might say, to publish in, are there not really to publish innovative work, but less innovative work. And if I refer you to Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, an absolutely crucial book from the 1970s, Kuhn said that most research done in universities is what he calls normal research, tinkering around the edges of a paradigm. And Kuhn says that the system is not really set up at all to shift paradigms. It's just there to maintain existing paradigms. And so it is with mainstream journals. So that's one problem. They're not geared up to being innovative at all. The second problem is the fact that the whole process of selecting articles for peer review publication is highly questionable. And we haven't got very long today, but if I just flag up 3 issues. First is the arbitrary nature of the whole process of peer review. And you don't need to take my word for that. We've had editors-in-chief like Robbie Fox from the British Medical Journal and Richard Horton from another medical journal, this time the Lancet, both vouching for the arbitrary nature whereby articles get selected. Robbie Fox obviously had a sense of humour. He said, how do we know that if you don't throw a pile of articles down the stairs, that we just publish those that reach the bottom? And Richard Horton obviously likes language. Here's his description of the peer review process. He describes it as biased, unjust, unaccountable, incomplete, and frequently wrong. So you get their points. Not only that, but these journals very often have their own agendas. And the best way of illustrating that is with reference to something that Richard Horton, editor-in-chief of The Lancet, said back in 2020, which was that we need to, he said, reinvent the scientific journal so that it becomes more activist. Yep, he's saying the journal should be selecting articles to fit certain themes. And separately from that, he said that journals need to, picking up on what Diane told us just then, that journals need to follow the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the final problem I'd like to draw your attention to, which you may be less aware of, I don't know, is the problem of plagiarism. Yep. It's been found that several academics, many of them extremely senior, have been guilty of the cardinal sin of plagiarism. And if you look at the next table, you'll see some of the main offenders noted down. So we've got institutions on the left, got Harvard, the #1 university in the US. They're fifth highest paid professor, Francesca Gino, whose research topic was honesty and ethical behavior, was found to have falsified her data sets. She's no longer employed by Harvard University. And Stanford, high up the pecking order in American universities, the president, no less, Mark Tessier-Levine, he had to resign in 2023 since he hadn't corrected errors pointed out to him by the journal. And Harvard, again, their cancer institute, the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, has, I think this is still being investigated, the amount of extensive use of AI in papers that they've been putting out and other misdemeanors. So all is not well in peer review, which is the linchpin. And it's the linchpin largely because academic promotion, recruitment is very much dependent on the number of journal articles that you have to your credit. And every 7 or 8 years in Britain, universities are subjected to a massive research assessment exercise in which the peer review outputs are the main barometer, shall we say, of a university's research excellence. Well, that's what they say. And so can't stress too highly the important place that peer review occupies in academia. And if the system itself is open to abuse in the way that we've said, you might question the very value of the academic system in which that is placed. Third factor that might be moving us away from the worthy ideals of George Beadle and Humboldt, and that's the global focus that we find in universities today. And there's another slide here that illustrates this. The World Economic Forum, would you believe, has grouped universities under its umbrella. And this grouping of universities is called the Global Universities Leaders Forum, GULF. And, well, you could guess, I'm sure, the universities that are members of GULF. These so-called top universities in Britain, America, and elsewhere. What can we say when universities are captured by the World Economic Forum and its invidious agendas? And not just that, but you can find on the WEF website an article written by a then very senior Oxford academic, Pro-Vice Chancellor, External Affairs, co-authored by a professor at Queensland. And this was 2020. I'm quoting from this book, The Dark Side of Academia, page 149. Just a very short extract from these two professors' article, talking about the place of teaching and research in universities. They say that through their engagement, teaching and research, universities must redouble their efforts to work alongside corporations, governments, and NGOs as they search for new business models and policies to assist the Great Reset. Well, we could really stop there, couldn't we, with those three factors? We're seeing the university system captured by private funding and by global agendas. And we've reached a point where, you may have read about this last year, a lecturer at University College London was removed from her module leadership following complaints from Chinese students, who make up now 25% of the student body at University College London. And they contribute not the 9,000 something pounds that domestic students contribute, but a weighty £40,000 apiece. And the crime of the lecturer, it was to highlight data from the Global Slavery Index, which suggested that China had the second highest prevalence of modern slavery in the world. And she was also labelled anti-Chinese after catching 2 Chinese students cheating in an exam. And her head of department at University College London said that the university needed to retain a good reputation among future Chinese applications. So where is this taking us?
That's a good question. If I could just add in there as well, I think my most recent university experience is a little bit more recent than yours, since you left the system. And I would say that even especially since 2020, there's been a major increase in the number of international students. And I think part of this might be due to the funding issues that we're talking about, because to be attending state universities, US universities, Canadian universities, anywhere in the West, because of the amount that they pay. And the other issue with that is that the quality is going down of our graduates, because a lot of them are not as qualified to be there as they should be in terms of their language requirements and in terms of their preparation for high-level academic work. And so we get the money coming in, but we're not creating good graduates. So then actually what happens is that the entire system erodes, because we're not producing good research, and the research that we are producing is trying to meet the needs of the globalist demands that are placed on us to meet the Sustainable Development Goals or make the World Economic Forum happy with us. And then you lose the whole point of why you're doing this work in the first place. Which leads to our next point here, which is academic freedom, right? So one of the reasons that I lost my position in the system, not that I'm sad about it anymore, but because I have this wonderful platform now with UK Column, and I'm more than happy to be here. But the problem that is actually happening is that academic freedom in general is just going along with, as we cover frequently on UK Column, issues of freedom of speech, issues of what we're allowed to say and not say in this entire society, where it's one of those things that's supposed to be very well protected in a university system. And one of the things I got in trouble for example, was talking about, just like you did, issues of sex and gender, the issues of not putting pornographic material in front of children in libraries, which is obviously very important to me, which I've covered extensively. The problem is that one of the things that we've seen recently that one of our UK Column authors has uncovered, Hugh McCarthy, is that the UN and the World Health Organization, for example, believe that children should be treated as sexual beings from birth. And that's now in globalist policy. So if I speak out and say we shouldn't be putting sex manuals in front of 6-year-olds, that's actually going against globalist policy, which is then funding the university. So it's all in a big circle that you can't get out of once you try to expose what's going on. So if you want to say anything else about academic freedom, that's just been one example of what's happened to me, but I know it's happened to a lot of others as well for speaking out on different issues.
Well, exactly. And I put a table together just highlighting some of the academics who've been censored, ranging from Professor Julie Ponesse, in one of the largest universities in Canada. She refused to take the vaccine. She was a professor of ethics, would you believe it? And she insisted on informed consent, as she should, and she lost her job. And here in Britain, Professor Chris Exley from Keele University, his focus was on the harms of aluminium, including in vaccines, not exclusively in vaccines, and life became extremely difficult for Professor Exley. And then in America, Mark Tukachinsky, a molecular immunologist and actually president at the time of Thomas Jefferson University, his crime was liking a number of tweets that questioned the COVID treatments, questioned what you were talking about there, Diane, I think gender reassignment, big pharma. And so he lost his job. And there is an irony there, because Thomas Jefferson himself actually said that people cannot be safe without information. And then There's the case of Professor E, whose story is described in this book here, Professor of Management and Marketing, whose work on best practice leadership was not encouraged by her university. In fact, she had a commission to write an article for one of the leading newspapers on education in the world, and the university told her that she was not to send that article on best practice leadership out. It subsequently came to light in an email that article could have caused, in the view of the senior people of that university, could have caused people to question the leadership style and effectiveness of vice chancellors, who, we will get to this in a little bit, operate a very, very top-down leadership style. I would say, from my own background in organizational psychology, that this is worst practice leadership. But a bit like you were saying, Diane, it does seem to be a style, this very controlling style of leadership, that is being promoted by those pulling the strings. So the Rockefeller Foundation produced a report in 2010 entitled Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. And it was engaged in a number of scenario plans. What that report of Rockefeller predicted was a world of tighter top-down government control, a world of more authoritarian leadership, because, the report says, limited innovation was needed from the populations of the world. So Professor E, who promotes a very different type of leadership, is not going to find a natural home in a mainstream university. So we're talking about the cancellation, not just of people who threaten the medical system or mainstream science, but people who threaten the system of control that operates in our world today. And according to somebody I know you know, Diane, Dennis Hayes, and this is the next table, Professor Emeritus now of Education, he was at Derby University. Universities cannot really be said to be universities unless they allow unrestricted freedom of speech. And quite how restricted speech is difficult to get a handle on, but there was a unique moment in 2018 when a magazine, Spiked, undertook a survey on free speech in universities. And you can see what they found on that table. Quite shocking. This was a few years ago. It's probably worse now. They found that 55% of universities actively censor speech, 39% stifle speech through excessive regulation. And the shocking conclusion was that just 6% of universities are truly free, open places.
I guess I would add in there as well that I've been covering on UK Column the issue of the current act that was passed in 2023 that was meant to protect freedom of speech and academic freedom in higher education. When Bridget Phillipson first came into office as Education Secretary last year, she halted it, saying, well, there's potential for hate speech and anti-Semitism and all these other things that she was bringing in, saying that we needed to look at it to make sure that there was no harm being done. And it's now going through as of the 1st of August. The Office for Students has provided some guidance on how to do this. And unfortunately, they've taken away the tort reform that was going to be in there because you can no longer sue for having your rights violated financially because universities don't have the money to pay for it. I think it was the University of Exeter recently that got fined, was £575,000 for not following the academic freedom principles for somebody. And I've also got an interview with Professor Dennis Hayes on UK Column, which viewers can find if they want to get the full idea of academic freedom from his perspective, as well as representative from the students for Academics for Academic Freedom, which I did late last year in 2024. So you can look at those for more detail. The issues for students is that there's the decolonization agenda, which is also very dangerous for protecting basically the British system of knowledge, all of the history in this country and in any Western country where they're pushing this decolonization agenda. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
As we speak, libraries are decolonizing the books in those libraries. Exeter University, if you want to see what's going on, look no further than Exeter in the West Country. They have a reading group discussing liberating the library, what it means to decolonize. And you explained, I think, Diane, that often means removing books written by Caucasians.
If you want to learn more, sorry, I'm going to hold this up for the viewers. This book called Narrative Expansion tells exactly how this is being done, interpreting decolonization in academic libraries. This is published by CILIP, which is my former professional body for library and information professionals in the UK. Tells exactly how they're doing it. And this is also happening not just for libraries, but for curriculum as well. A lot of subjects, probably all of the subjects now, have guidance within their own universities or their own professional bodies on how to decolonize the curriculum, which again, people are seeing that textbooks that they've used for years for their students or for their research are disappearing from the library catalogs and from the collections because they were written by white people or straight men or whatever the offense of the moment is. And they're putting in this critical race theory. We're also seeing that exams are being considered racist because they are somehow a problem for people who didn't grow up in the British system of education. So we are disadvantaging these international students who are coming here and paying £40,000 a year to get a British education. So we see a lot of things happening around the academic freedom, but also this is also causing our students to have problems because they can no longer apparently handle hearing certain curriculum points. If it sounds too white or it's too offensive, then they get triggered and they have safe spaces that they're allowed to go to and experience therapy dogs so that they can calm down and get a cup of tea. And I've covered this as well on new segments. But I think that actually all does tie into academic freedom because students are just no longer able to handle it because they're coming in with expectations, with mental health issues, with however they were affected during the lockups that we went through in 2020 and 2021. So there's a lot of things going on there. And I think that leads us to our next point, which is declining academic standards. If you want to go into that next.
It does very much look as though there's a massive decline in the standards of marking that contribute to the degree classification that students come away with. And I've put together a table so that showing that this isn't a matter of opinion. This is very much a matter of fact. I'm focused here on the British situation. So back in the year 1970, a first-class degree was very rarely awarded. If you were at Warwick University, it was awarded to just 6% of the cohort. Bath University, very similar, 8%. Cambridge, slightly higher. But we're well under the 15% mark. Fast forward to the 1990s, incidentally, that's the time that Tony Blair introduced tuition fees towards the end of the 1990s. And the average, before the tuition fees was introduced, the average proportion of students who were awarded a first-class degree was just 7%. Then we get the advent of tuition fees, and things start to change. 2009 to 2010, these are averages across Britain. 15% of students get first-class degrees. You can see the numbers. It's edging up all the time. 18%. By 2018-19, had reached 28%. 2019-20, massive increase up to 35%. And by 2020-2021, it had reached 37%, 30 times higher than it had been in the 1970s. In fact, the years before tuition fees were introduced. And well, perhaps it's not surprising, because these days universities treat students as customers. And I don't know about you, Diane, but in my time in a mainstream British universities, I was frequently told by students that they expected to get a first-class degree, and what do they need to do to get it. So there was a presumption on their part. And these weren't always, well, these might be, in my view, average students, but they were considering themselves as worthy of top degrees. So something big has happened in universities. And by the way, these figures are just averages on the table. I believe that University College London, the average figure there is about 50% of students getting first-class degrees, and it's even higher in music colleges, where it can reach the 80% mark.
There have been a couple of things, again, very recently that have contributed to this being even worse. One is the rise of AI. In my last year or so in the system, I was seeing students submitting ChatGPT written work, and the university told me, when I had suspicions that the students didn't write their work, I was told to just mark the work at face value, because I had no way to prove that the students didn't write the work. It's not the same as if it's copied and pasted somewhere on the internet, and we have plagiarism detecting software that can find that this was published on another website somewhere. When it's just kind of the gibberish that ChatGPT writes, sometimes there's no way to prove it. But one of the things that it does do, that's one thing to look for if you are a lecturer and you're watching this, is that it will sometimes create fake references. So it will put together an author's name, a journal title, an article name, and it doesn't exist. So if you go to look for the actual journal article and it's complete rubbish, that's a fake reference. But then that takes a lot of time to check all of that, to make sure that they're using real references. And you can also pay for upgrades that students can buy to make sure that they're using real references if they want to put some money behind it. So there's all kinds of things that are going on in the background that are causing these issues with standards. And again, the expectations, as you said. I even had parents that called me when they were upset that they had spent money on their child's education and they didn't get the marks that they thought that the children deserved. And then they would get really angry with me when I would say, there are GDPR rules, they're over 18, I can't discuss this with you, because they saw themselves as the customer, because they were the ones paying the fees for their child to be there. So it was a very difficult position for me to be in, especially when I was a program director. So I guess talking about finances, that brings us to our next point, which is value for money. Universities.
Well, yeah, that concept of value for money was introduced by the Higher Education and Research Act 2017. And my goodness, this has had major consequences for higher education. I'll just highlight two here. One is the axing of many humanities courses and much humanities research funding. So we're talking about the axing of modern languages, English literature, history, and all in the name of value for money, because, this links to the second point, really. The targets have been set for universities in terms of the employability of their students, all under this concept of value for money. And one target is that 60% of graduates from a particular university must have obtained managerial or professional employment. And one view is that humanities graduates may be less likely to help those universities hit those targets than universities for more applied subjects. Well, that would stand to reason, wouldn't it? Perhaps IT, business, science, medicine. This concept of value for money, at what cost does it come? Philip Pullman, who's an economist, describes in chilling words the likely effects of the axing of humanities courses as being emotional, and imaginative starvation. And I speak as somebody who did a first degree in modern languages, and I basically spent 4 years reading French poetry and plays and French novels. And I think I benefited enormously from those 4 years. I wouldn't have it any otherwise, really. And so this concept of value for money, it's leading to, one might say, a very impoverished society in terms of culture and spirit.
I agree. My first degree was actually in Spanish. I kind of did Spanish and business and computing. So I did a lot of reading of Spanish poetry and Spanish literature, and the history of at least the Spanish-speaking world across the pond in Mexico and South America and Central America. And one of the things that it did for me was it actually made me a better writer in English, to learn another language at that level. It made my English writing better. It made my communication better, kind of opened up my view of the world in a lot of ways that those of us who only ever learn one language might not experience. So there was value to that, and obviously created a good foundation for what I went on to do professionally for much longer. So I can't imagine that I would have received or wanted a managerial professional role from that first degree, because that was not in my plan. Actually, my original plan was to be a Spanish teacher, and I just didn't end up going that way. But that idea, I think, as well, of you only go to university to get a high-paying job is one of the other things that's destroying the educational system, because that's not the only purpose of a university education. So now I think we've got just one last point to cover here, because I know we're watching the time, but our last point here is the managerial nature of universities. And this goes back into what you mentioned at the beginning as well. And I know there's some other points to talk about. The Research Excellence Framework, or the REF, which is basically used as the way to, I guess we could quantify the quality of the research, and that then influences the funding at universities. And it's very biased towards the Oxbridge universities, or the Russell Group universities, the highest universities in the UK system, because they obviously have the most resources to create the best research according to the Research Excellence Framework. I'll put a link in the write-up so that people can read about the REF. And in more recent years, we've had the Teaching Excellence Framework as well, or the TEF. So then again, we're putting in these somewhat, I don't know, dubious things that we have to reach, I would say. I don't even know how to describe them as to what is considered research excellence or teaching excellence. And if you don't meet those requirements, at least at the research-based universities where I worked, you have a constant threat of being put onto a teaching-only contract. So the papers are rated from 1 to 4 stars. You don't necessarily know who's going to rate them or even why. But if you don't create the right number of 3-star or 4-star publications within, let's say, a 7-year time period, or even in a particular year, you have the constant threat of being put into a teaching-only contract and losing your research time that you worked so many years to work towards, which is quite demotivating for someone. But do you have any other points you want to cover on this managerial sort of highly measured approach to academia?
Well, yeah, and I would just add, to corroborate what you're saying, there was a research professor, I think it was at Imperial, who had a financial objective of bringing in £200,000 and it didn't look as though he would attain that, and he committed suicide. You probably heard about that shocking case.
Yes.
So on the managerial front, and I've alluded to this earlier, the leadership is very top-down, managerial in style. And, well, my God, I'm a long way from those original universities. Do you remember Universitas Scholarium et Magistrorum, a group of teachers and students? My goodness, what we have now is an almighty edifice with a hierarchy spanning vice-chancellor, deputy vice-chancellor, pro-vice-chancellor, down to deans and deputy deans and you name it. And I just thought I'd quote at random one university, what they write on their website. And this happens to be Leeds University, but I'm not singling them out. They refer to the existence there of a university executive group, UEG, which comprises the vice-chancellor and president, provost and deputy vice-chancellor, pro-vice-chancellors, executive deans, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, chief people and culture officer, and the university secretary and registrar. And so what is the result of this top-heavy management, which is pervasive in the university sector? Well, according to Professor Peter Mandler, Professor of History at Cambridge, there is a dramatically growing gap between the senior management and their working colleagues. Other academics speak about pending civil war. But perhaps, we started by talking about the withdrawal of funding, the withdrawal of government funding. Such funding as there is, a lot of it is going to finance these extremely senior posts. Is this what universities today should look like? And are they still worthy of the title of university? Remembering that it comes from that Latin word, universitas, meaning a group of students and teachers. Is the function of this massive hierarchy to impose control over the teaching and research of those involved in those activities? Well, I think we mustn't be too negative. I don't know that this system can be reformed in its current state. It's down to us, I do think, to create something better, something new. And I don't think that what we're looking at here fulfills the lofty ideals of Humboldt and George Beadle at Chicago University. And I think we need to return to those ideals with a smaller institution. I paved the way with Truth University. If you're interested in helping with that initiative or studying for a research qualification, do get in touch. www.truthuniversity.co.uk is the website. I think this is too far gone, the system, and we need to, a bit like the French Impressionists, we need to start afresh. And they created new salon for the French Impressionists. The old salon were no longer capable of identifying innovation in the field of fine art. So they started with some new salon. Is that where we're at now, do you think, Diane?
I think so. I guess it reminds me of some of our UK column members who are always joking that those of us on the UK column team could create a whole new government. And they've already appointed me as the education secretary, Brian Garish as prime minister, Ben Rubin as finance minister, and so on. So we've got a backup plan in case we really get to that point. I'll just leave that there. We're just about out of time, unfortunately. Are there any other points that you wanted to cover that we haven't been able to mention so far?
I'd like just to mention one on the subject of humanities, because it turns out both you and I started off at university with modern languages. And I've covered this in this book, Light Bulb Moments and the Power of Critical Thinking, which I wrote with Catherine Armitage. And you might hope that new graduates would excel in critical thinking, but a survey by the OECD, a vast survey, 800,000 students, discovered that only 45% of new graduates had what they considered to be critical thinking skills. But those students that were most likely to have it out of the cohort of students that they looked at were, guess what? From the humanities.
That's an interesting point to end on. I think I wanted to say as well that to let the audience know that we have 2 more interviews planned with Gloria. The next one will be with Ben Rubin, and they will be talking about some common interests that they have. And then the third one will be back with me again, which will be, I believe, a topic that will totally shock and surprise a lot of people that see what we have to cover in the third interview. So just to conclude this first one, I just wanted to thank you again, Gloria, for working so well with me on uncovering what I think we will call a higher education in crisis for this particular interview. And I really hope that the British public will see this as much as possible so that they know where their tax money is going. And if they have young people or people of any age attending universities in 2025, what exactly they're being exposed to and what's going on behind the scenes. And I really hope that this will make people think about what they're doing and what they will expect going forward from the British university system, which of course is the oldest in the world and known to be the most reputable. And it's absolutely tragic what has happened to the university system and to those of us who are actually out for really seeking truth. And so with that, I think I will leave it there. This is, again, Diane Rasmussen McAdie with UK Column News. And Gloria, thank you again for joining me. It was a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you so much, Diane.